Up next, we have, here we go, fabulous Ian Wong will be joining us. He's currently the Senior Director of RF and Wireless Architecture, reporting to the CTO at VIAVI Solutions, where he's leading RF and wireless technology strategy, architectures, and standards. He is the co-chair of the Test and Integration Focus Group and in the O-RAN Alliance, and VIAVI's representative at the full member and steering groups of the NextG Alliance. He is also chief architect of the VIAVI Automated Lab as a Service for Open RAN, which was awarded $21.7 million by the NTIA Public Wireless Supply Chain Innovation Fund, which we heard a little bit about this morning with SJ, from the first notice of funding, or NOFO 1. From 2009 to August of 2020, he was with NI, formerly National Instruments, which was acquired by Emerson, where his last position was Section Manager of Wireless Systems R&D, where he led the development of real-time end-to-end 5G wireless test and prototyping systems, and managed the company's 3GPP wireless standards and IP strategy. From 2007 to 2009, he was a systems research and standards engineer with Freescale Semiconductor, where he represented Freescale in the 3GPP LTE standardization efforts. He is a senior member of the IEEE, was the Director of Industry Communities for IEEE Communications Society from 2016 to 2019, and was the Industry Program Chair for the IEEE GlobeCom 2014 in Austin. Dr. Wong is lead editor of the book Open RAN, the Definitive Guide, published by Wiley IEEE in 2023, co-authored the book Resource Allocation for Multi-User, Multi-Carrier Wireless Systems, published by Springer, numerous patents, standards contributions, and IEEE journal and conference publications. He was awarded the Texas Telecommunications Engineering Consortium Fellowship in 2003 to 2004 and the Wireless Networking and Communications Group Student Leadership Award in 2007. He received his MS and PhD degrees in electrical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin in 2004 and 2007 respectively, and a BS degree in electronics and communications engineering magna cum laude from the University of the Philippines in 2000. So if you can all help me welcome Ian Wong. Here you go.
Thank you, Laura. We need to shorten that bio.
That's on you.
Yeah, thanks for the kind introduction. When you introduce yourself as a principal and English teacher, I must admit I was a bit nervous.
I came to the principal's office.
Yeah, I brought back memories. English was never my strongest subject. That's why I became an engineer. I think a lot of us would relate. So, thanks for having me. I'm here to kind of talk a little bit about where we are in O-RAN, test integration. So I actually chair the test integration focus group in the O-RAN Alliance. It's not such a big audience, so small, we can interact. I think that's really what makes it more interesting for me. So feel free to stop, we can chat, and we can dive right into it. So this slide was already shown by Tracy. It shows really O-RAN Alliance. I would say it's a very unique standards development organization. Obviously, as any SDO, the spec effort is the most important, and that is where the bulk of the work is being done. Obviously, from the specifications, you have implementations, and these implementations needs to be tested. So O-RAN is pretty unique that it has its own test integration effort, which is the group that I co-chair, and also an open source community. And I think that makes it let's call it a symbiotic relationship between using software as a way to really inform standards and standards informing software, which I think is a very good model. So what is we're all engineers, we kind of like to see block diagrams, right? So from a testing integration standpoint, this is really how things flow. It always starts with normative specifications on the key aspects, of course, of the O-RAN architecture. A lot of us have probably seen the diagram multiple times. What every work group in O-RAN Alliance does is actually goes through these specs and create three types of test specifications. Okay, so one is conformance. Does my implementation conform to this specification? For example, the open front haul. But as with any spec, it's really important more than ever for ORAN to really show interoperability. So there's actually, every work group also works on interoperability specs. It's essentially a pair of equipment over a particular interface. Do they work together? And then come up with profiles around the interoperability, because every, for example, parameter in the open front haul can be, there's a lot of different parameters. So you need to make sure that a certain profile is followed so that the pair can interoperate. And finally, end-to-end is the spec that is owned by the group that I chair, TIFG, and it actually looks at the whole base station, ORAN base station, and see whether they perform well. So the other things that we do in TIFG is the plug fests. We heard about that as well from Tracy's talk. This is happening now twice a year. And then OTICs are the open labs. So we're close to about 19 already, actually exactly 19 now in ORAN. And that's really where a lot of the tests can be done by, can be conducted from vendors to get a certificate and badge. And so I'm going to talk quite a bit about the ORAN certification and badging program today as well, on the different options for that. So this gives you an outline. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into each of these. So in TIFG, we actually split the work into 3 task groups. So the group that I pretty much am most active on is the testing task group. So we coordinate all the test specs around the different work groups. We want to make sure that we actually have a common understanding of how the test specs work. And we actually meet pretty much monthly as a whole group. And we also own the end-to-end spec, as I mentioned. And then certification badging, focus obviously on the certification badging. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And OTICs and PlugFest is kind of the third task group. Okay, and a little bit about the end-to-end test spec. Okay, so I would say this is the one that's of a lot of interest, definitely from operators, because this is ultimately what they want to see is something that is deployable. So these are the various things, definitely going through functional, performance, services, load and stress, and the newest chapter is on RIC-enabled use case testing, which is something that we're still exploring, and we're currently looking into end-to-end, QoS, QoE optimization for end-to-end tests. So this is a published spec. We're in our 6th version. It's actually heavily leveraged as well in the Accord labs that we heard from Tracy about in AT&T. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about certification and badging. I think this is a pretty hot topic right now. We heard from Tracy this morning about this program. I mean, this has been going on for about 2 to 3 years now. It really shows kind of a good pulse to the maturity of the vendor ecosystem. Okay, so a equipment vendor can go through really 3 different types of certificates and badges. Okay, so first is what we call an ORAN certificate. You see the logo there, certified. For example, today we have the ORU with Open Front Haul can get a certificate. An ODU with Open Front Haul can also get that certificate. And it shows compliance to the spec. And it's only one piece of equipment across one interface showing that you are compliant. The IoT badge essentially is a pair of equipment coming together. For example, in this case, combine DUCU via Open Front Haul and show interoperability between the DU and the RU over the front haul interface, or across X2 or F1C or 2 GNOBs over XNC. So if you're a pair of equipment, go to an OTIC, you show interoperability across certain level of profiles, you can get an interoperable badge. And finally, the end-to-end badge is essentially RU, DU, CU together to show that you're functional. So the main purpose of this is, again, more functionality and security, just 2 aspects. The performance test, load and stress are all optional tests that can be done to show, obviously the market that you are mature. So that gives you a brief overview of what's available today. And this talk is about latest progress, so I wanted to show you what is the latest and greatest. So ORAN is interesting in that it actually releases specs every 4 months. So there's actually 3, we call them spec trains. And so this one is the latest after the July train. So you can see here kind of a bit of a color coding. If it's green, that means the spec is mature and it actually has a program to get a certificate or a badge around it, right? So you can see open front haul is the most mature with both conformance and interoperability available. Workgroup 5, which is really 3GPP interfaces that are profiled by ORAN. That's also available as a badge already today. And end-to-end. There's also a badge available today for the ecosystem. Okay, so you can see here a lot of gray. A lot of the gray is not applicable, which is okay. There's also a lot of yellow. Yellow means we're working on it. The test specs are kind of there and they're maturing, but they're not mature enough to have a certification and badging program around it. So that gives you a bit of a snapshot of where we are. And of course, the work groups and focus groups, there's 11 in total in ORAN, and the last one being TIFG at the bottom. So one thing that's new that's being discussed a lot today is use case testing. I think we also heard that as being valuable to operators. So there's really, a lot of this is around really the RIC, the non-RT and the near-RT RIC use case. And those are brand new specs being developed and still being coordinated because we do have some end-to-end RIC-enabled use case tests already in the end-to-end test spec. So moving on to where we are today as an ecosystem, this is actually available online in the ORAN public website, but we had 24 so far. Nothing to scream up and down about, but it's also not, at least it's not 0, right? So you can see here there's 24 certificates and badges issued. 14 certificates all on, obviously on the front haul. There's been 2 IoT badges, 8 end-to-end badges, and then 10 has been issued in this year alone. So it's gaining momentum. A few notable things here. You can see the interface, the device under test, the vendor, the OTIC name. A lot of Asia, right? So far, the Taiwan Aure OTIC, that's based in Taiwan. Asia Pacific OTIC is actually based in China. And Japan OTIC are really the most active. And you see a lot of the equipment vendors there. Mostly smaller vendors, some, let's call it tier 2 vendors, you can see there. And more recently, we've gotten a couple of certificates and badges also from Europe. The first 2 from Berlin that actually just came on earlier this year. So that's a snapshot for you. And as far as like the programs that are in development, the A1 certification and badging, I think it's most further along. We're working with Workgroup 2 on the non-RT RIC on A1 to see if we can get a certification badging program around that. OCloud, security, of course, and RIC-enabled end-to-end use case badging. So that gives you a bit of an overview of the certification and badging program in ORAN. Any questions on this? Yes, please.
Do you update your test plan or certificate program based on new releases from 3GPP, or is it based on industry demand?
So the question is, do we update the certification and badging program specifically based on whether it's 3GPP specs or based on demand? It's actually neither. It's mostly based on ORAN spec maturity and operator demand in ORAN. I think, as you know, ORAN Alliance is very heavily operator driven. In fact, it was started by operators. Operators lead all the groups, as operator co-chair. So a lot of it is operator driven, based also, of course, on the maturity of the ORAN spec. So clearly there's a very close tie-in to 3GPP. For example, the work group 5, interoperability, F1, X2, XN, these are all 3GPP interfaces, but profiled against the ORAN architecture. So hopefully that answered your question. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, one.
For the end-to-end, you mentioned that the certificate mostly requires functional, but you can go beyond and do like quality of service, performance testing end-to-end. Are those like defined like at that level, or is that still in the works? And kind of overall, what has carriers communicated in terms of like if a smaller vendor wants to kind of break into this space, what is the standard that they have to meet, right, to be able to?
Yeah. So let me repeat that question. There's two questions, right? The first one is more about the end-to-end. Today, for a badge, you only need functional. There's performance. In order for you to get that official badge from ORAN, all you need to do is show that you're functional. And a lot of those tests are very clearly spelled out. What are the mandatory tests? And actually that you also pass the SCAS tests on the G-Node B, right? We heard Paul talking about the srsRAN going through that in Berlin. So the performance specs, test specs are actually in the spec, very clearly laid out what needs to be done. But there are, the required KPIs are very well spelled out. But obviously there are no performance thresholds specified, right? Because it's too variable and depending on the type of base station, et cetera, et cetera. So load and stress is the same way, a RIC-enabled use case, services tests like Voner, Viner, all of those are actually pretty spelled out in the spec, but it's mostly about methodology and KPIs, but not necessarily performance thresholds. You had a second question about a smaller vendor and how they can...
Yeah, in terms of have you worked with carriers to kind of understand their expectations?
Yeah.
In terms of what kind of performance smaller or multi-vendor solutions?
It'll be good to look at the carriers here and see what they expect, right? At the end of the day, hey, performance, resiliency, energy efficiency, you can't cut corners, right? These are, our carrier friends are, they're ultimately accountable to their customers, which is ultimately us, right? But also the broader public. So just because you got a badge doesn't mean you're ready to be deployed, right? Although it's a signal that you have, you've seriously followed the ORAN specs, you've shown through a third-party test, not just through your own test, that you've complied. It at least opens up the door for the smaller vendors. Hence, the smaller vendors are the most invested in trying to get their name out there. The way the program works is once you get an official badge from any OTIC around the world, any operator member in ORAN can request for data. And they're supposed to share it immediately, right? It's like, okay, you want the results here. So it's all open to operator members all around the world. So you test it once in any OTIC, it's available everywhere. Andre?
Yeah, one question regarding the metrics that you showed there. So what's the current plan? Do you plan to go broader and basically filling out the yellow boxes and replacing the 3 boxes, so you have covered more essentially, or going deeper?
Yeah.
Extending the end-to-end test, for instance, adding performance tests. So what is, I guess the operators are pushing it, right?
Yeah.
So what do they want?
So I would say there's definitely a lot of push, I would say, from the technical steering committee within ORAN, which are obviously led by operators, to having more badge certificates available, especially, I would say around, OCloud, there's definitely some push there, security, A1, R1, those are things that are say, hey, we need to have a badging program around those. R1, for example, interoperability across apps is something that is pushed heavily. So I would say more on turning more of these green. But there are programs outside of O-RAN, right? Accord is a good example from the AT&T Verizon project, funded by the NTIA. I would say they're more interested in depth, right? Actually identifying the key things in these specs that we really want to test and showing performance, right? Resiliency, performance, and all that. So I would say, depending on the different group, at least within O-RAN, there's definitely push to having more available and actually seeing more certificates issued, right? It's almost like if you work in a company, there's always these charts and KPIs, and you kind of start charting. Okay, how many certificates have you issued? And that's all we get. It's like we don't control that, but at least we're trying to support more OTICs to be available, ready to issue it. Also quality. Okay, so there's the thing about as you see a lot of the OTICs, I would say they're at different levels of maturity as well, right? And so there's a push towards making sure that these are quality tests that are being conducted. Because O-RAN is a bit open. Let's call it open loop, right? It's a distributed labs. There's not really it's not a centralized like GCF or UE test, for example, right? It's fairly distributed. So we are trying to look more into seeing how we can enforce some quality across these certificates. Yes, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up exactly on this because I wanted to ask, how do you ensure uniformity in terms of the quality of tests so that one vendor or a provider is not at a disadvantage comparison to another that is doing it at another optic?
Yes, you hit the problem in the head, right? So there is no good way today. I think for a lot of reasons, O-RAN has avoided a much more centralized certification and badging approach, and that is an issue that we're trying to address. I mean, there are talks about using something like ISO 17025, which is actually an ISO standard for lab quality, to be either encouraged or imposed and stuff like that. Yeah, it's an issue that's being addressed. Okay, great. I mean, I'm glad to hear a lot of questions. So maybe I could move on quickly to the next part. I'm just looking at, we're okay. All right, so OTICs. So you heard me talk about OTICs a little bit. So these are qualified O-RAN Alliance labs. Basically, to be honest, to be an OTIC today is not that hard. All you need to be is not a vendor. No, I'm kidding. No, you have to show that you have equipment, that you have the capability. But the biggest importance is you can make sure that you can execute the test. You're not biased, and you have to sign an agreement as an OTIC with O-RAN to say I'm going to follow the specs, right? I'm not going to deviate, and that's really the main thing. And there's a lot of things. I mean, if you can see different OTICs, I mean, Virginia Tech is an OTIC as well. They can host plug fests, they can do reference setups. It's not just about certification and badging. Okay, so a lot of OTICs are more interested on the research side, for example, or on POCs, and etc. So that's something. I mean, previously there was a push to let's get more OTICs online. Now it's more of a reverse, more of the quality that I talked about. Okay. This is where we are today, 19 OTICs worldwide. It's spread around the world. It's fairly, I would say fairly healthy between Europe, Asia, and the Americas. You'll see a few trends that are quite interesting. The first few OTICs that came online are actually from Europe, from the main European operators. And it's pretty much the only operator-led OTICs today. You can see the next that came online were from Asia, and a lot of the ones from Asia, especially the Aure one in Taiwan, very active. Japan OTIC, Asia Pacific OTIC, and China. They're all very active in issuing certificates and badges. So the one in Taiwan is actually a professional test lab, for example. And then a lot of North America are actually power test beds, academic research labs. So it's kind of interesting to see that that trend and that dynamic coming out. But you can see, we kind of just marked, okay, if you're an OTIC that hosted the Plug Fest, put a P in there. If you're an OTIC that previously have issued at least one certificate or badge, you got that C and B mark there. So it just kind of shows you where the ecosystem is. And again, the focus now is not on adding more, but on actually supporting the vendor community, right? Like, let's say you're a startup or you have a product. Where do I go? I mean, obviously the first thing is regional, right? That's probably the first thing you want to go to. But also even there, if I'm in North America, it's like, where do I go, right? So it's not that easy. So we're trying to improve how we communicate the capabilities of the OTICs in the ORAN public website, making it clear what they're focusing on, etc. So that's something that is actively being worked on in the TIFG. Okay. Any questions on OTICs? That was pretty straightforward. And PlugFest, we heard about PlugFests. These are twice a year, spring and fall. Interestingly enough, I mean, there's very healthy PlugFest hosting and participation since 2019. And partially the reason is it's actually funded by the ORAN Alliance. So if you host a PlugFest, you do get some monetary support. In contrast to issuing a certificate and badge, you don't. So now you see kind of where the emphasis has been. So in the spring, I think a lot of you, we heard SRS participated in several of these as well. There were 10 venues, 18 labs, 78 companies, so it's pretty healthy participation. So what we've done recently is to focus on themes. It allows the community to rally around key areas of priority because, basically this is something that operators wanted to drive is like, hey, we can't just have PlugFests that are free for all. It doesn't, we need to kind of rally the community around certain areas. So these are the 5 themes that were utilized in the previous PlugFest. You can see system testing with layer 1 acceleration, consistent and repeatable testing, ORAN energy efficiency, DevOps and test automation, front haul with multiple RUs, kind of transport testing. So those are the current themes. There's another theme that was not utilized in this PlugFest, which is kind of more the white box theme. So let's see. A little plug on VIAVI. So we have been supporting PlugFest since day one, since 2019, since the very first one. So we've crossed the 100 mark. So supported over 100 PlugFest demos across 16 labs all around the world. So you can see splattering of different tests, geographies, logos here, etc. And it's the same for this fall. We're also supporting a lot of those PlugFests. Any questions about PlugFest? Very straightforward. We're almost there, huh? Okay, all right. You see this, the principal thing is, okay, all right. So just the last slide, a bit on the company that's funding me to come here. So we're a trusted partner in ORAN test. You heard srsRAN is also a user of VIAVI. Thank you. We basically have a whole gamut of tools from the lab to the field, right? Field instrumentation, and we're trusted by all the tier 1 network equipment manufacturers and also all the up and coming ORAN vendors today. So we also wrote a book on ORAN. I actually is the lead editor for this book. It's available on Amazon. So it'll be in its. I saw that there is a recent book that came out from Virginia Tech. Is that right? So we have competition. Yes. No, that's good. That's a good thing. I saw that, and that means it's gaining steam. This is all about getting the ecosystem fired up. And so yeah, and we have multiple leadership positions in ORAN Alliance. One thing that I mean, the picture it kind of messed up there, but we also did win an NTIA award from the NOFO 1 very recently. We're proud to be the only non-operator winner in terms of the TNE, the labs. So as you heard, Accord is one, Orchid from Dish EchoStar is the other one, so we're the third one. So yeah, we're actually doing a ribbon cutting next week on Monday. I mean, it's an open invitation to folks to kind of come join us. Again, its vision is to have automated tests to drive down the cost. And yeah, I mean, we're actually talking to SRS to see if they could be one of the first customers. Hopefully that will turn out well. And for all especially the smaller vendors out there, I mean, it's big and small, but it's meant to really cater to the folks that want to do these tests before they go in front of an operator. Right? You can think of it as a pre-SAT for the SATs. So anyway, I will end there. If there are any other questions. Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it. Fantastic.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you.